At 23:45 on October 19, 1942, Lieutenant Robert Lynch crouched behind the wheel of PT-48, watching 3 Japanese Daihatsu barges cut across the black water off Cape Esperance. 26 years old, 14 night patrols, 0 confirmed kills. The barges below him were carrying 60 troops and a full load of ammunition to reinforce Guadalcanal, each one armored well enough to shrug off rifle fire and armed with a Type 92 heavy machine gun of its own. Lynch had 4 Mark 8 torpedoes on his bow, each one over 2,000 pounds with a warhead heavy enough to break a destroyer in half, and every one of them was useless tonight. The torpedoes ran no shallower than 10 feet. The barges drew 5. His weapons would pass clean underneath every target he found. By mid-October, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had already lost 6 boats and 17 sailors running this exact play. Spot the barges, run the torpedo attack, watch the fish pass harmlessly beneath the hulls, take return fire, limp home, or burn. The twin 50 caliber Brownings on PT-48 could throw 850 rounds a minute, devastating against a wooden fishing boat, and utterly useless against Daihatsu armor plate. Rounds sparked off the steel and did nothing. The Japanese called this the Tokyo Express, and when American air power made destroyer runs too costly, they switched to barges instead. Smaller, slower, far harder to spot at night, and immune to everything a PT boat carried. Squadron commanders at Tulagi were out of good ideas. A few crews had already lashed single-shot Army 37mm anti-tank guns to their bows with timber planking, Lieutenant John Kennedy's PT-109 among them, but a gun that fired once and needed a manual reload while Japanese machine guns raked the deck wasn't a real answer. The math simply didn't work. Each barge carried 60 armed men or 8 tons of supplies. The Japanese were running 20 to 30 of them past Guadalcanal every single night, and a PT boat needed to sink several per patrol just to matter. One shot at a time wasn't going to cut it. 3 miles inland, Henderson Field told a different story. Marines had taken the airstrip back in August, and by October, it had become a graveyard of wrecked aircraft. Bettys, Zeros, and dozens of Bell P-39 Airacobras scattered in pieces around the runway apron. The P-39 was an odd machine, engine mounted behind the pilot, propeller shaft running under the cockpit floor, and that unusual layout had left room in the nose for something Lynch couldn't stop thinking about. A 37mm Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon, firing straight through the propeller hub, 150 rounds a minute from a 30-round magazine, muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet a second, built to shred light armor and aircraft alike. If you want to see whether a scavenged airplane cannon could actually sink an armored barge, hit that like button. We'll keep the story rolling. Subscribe if you haven't. Back to Lynch. Most of those wrecks were total losses. Engines seized, wings sheared off. But the cannons themselves, buried in intact nose sections, hadn't been touched. Nobody had stripped them, because nobody had a reason to. They were aircraft weapons, with no mounting point anywhere on a naval hull, no installation doctrine, and absolutely no official approval to try. Lynch walked the field at dawn on October 20th and counted 23 wrecked Airacobras, stood next to one with its nose buried in coral, and did the math on a cannon that could fire 5 times faster than anything currently on his boat. By 1400 hours, he was standing in front of Commander Alan Calvert, with no procurement form, no official channel, and no way to describe what he wanted except plainly. Calvert said yes. By 1630, 4 crews were walking Henderson Field with cutting torches and wrenches, racing a sunset that gave them roughly 6 hours to strip working cannons out of dead airframes. Technical Sergeant James Kugan, who'd maintained P-39 stateside before the war, led the extraction. 8 bolts per cannon, a socket size off by a 1/16 of an inch, close enough for wartime, disconnecting hydraulic lines, feed chutes, and firing solenoids before cutting each gun free of its engine mount. 2 hours a wreck if everything went right. Nothing went right on the second aircraft. 11 days of tropical heat had seized the mounting bolts solid, and with no penetrating oil on the whole airfield, the crew soaked them in aviation gasoline and waited 20 minutes just to get movement. By 1730, they had 3 complete cannon assemblies lying on the coral. One with a cracked recoil cylinder, unusable, one with a bent feed pawl fixable with a file, and one in pristine working order. A working cannon still needed something to sit on, and PT boats had never been built to carry one. The bow deck ahead of the chart house was flat plywood over oak stringers, nothing designed to absorb the recoil of an automatic cannon or survive the flex of a wooden hull planing across waves at 40 knots. Chief Machinist's mate Donald Frey sketched the whole mount in 40 minutes with a grease pencil on a sheet of aluminum. A steel base plate, a welded pipe column, a rotating collar, a yoke to cradle the gun, and built it entirely from scrap steel pulled off wrecked landing gear, welding in 5-minute bursts, because the generator kept dying from fuel rationing. By 2100 hours the mount existed. Ugly welds, scorched paint, 3 degrees of wobble in the collar, but it held the weight and it rotated. Probably enough. A truck carried the cannon and mount to the dock at Lunga Point, with 3 sailors bracing it against every pothole on the road. A Higgins boat ferried it across to Tulagi, and Lynch's crew, who'd already drilled and marked the mounting holes by hand, bolted the base plate down through 3/4 of an inch of plywood and 2 inches of oak framing. By 001:15 on October 21st, the cannon sat on PT-48's bow, elevating, depressing, and rotating, however roughly. Nobody had solved ammunition yet. The M4's horseshoe magazines held 30 rounds each and weighed 40 pounds loaded, designed to live in a P-39's dedicated ammunition bay, something PT-48 simply didn't have. They stacked 6 loaded magazines on the open deck beside the mount, and accepted that a man would have to hand-feed the gun mid-fight. Crude, untested, functional maybe. At 0200 hours, PT-48 carried the first aircraft automatic cannon ever mounted on a United States Navy patrol boat. Assembled, welded, and bolted together in 9 hours flat, never fired once, never stress-tested. Operated by a crew with 0 training on the weapon. None of that mattered. The barges were running again that night. 4 boats went out that evening, PT-40, PT-46, PT-48, and PT-60, in standard split formation off Cape Esperance. Gunner's mate second-class Harold Mitchell, who'd fired twin 50s on a dozen patrols and never touched an aircraft cannon in his life, volunteered to work it, armed with nothing more than Kugan's dockside instructions. Point it, pull the trigger, swap magazines when it runs dry, and trust the recoil system to absorb the rest. The night was overcast, no moon, visibility barely 200 yards, sea calm, PT-48 running quiet on 2 engines at 15 knots. At 23:55, radar picked up 4 contacts at 4,000 yards, 8 knots, exactly the profile of a barge convoy running supplies down the slot. Standard doctrine called for closing to 1,000 yards before a torpedo run. Worthless doctrine against barges the torpedoes couldn't touch anyway. Lynch needed to get close enough for Mitchell's cannon to actually matter, and that meant driving straight into effective machine gun range on a weapon nobody had ever fired outside a test range. At 3,000 yards, he could make out 4 Daihatsu barges in line, 49 feet each, troops visible on their decks. At 1500, Mitchell charged the cannon by hand, chambered the first round, and flipped the safety off. Nobody aboard knew what was about to happen. At 1,000 yards, the lead barge's Type 92 opened up first, tracers stitching the water 30 yards short. Lynch held course anyway, committed now past any point of turning back. At 800 yards, Mitchell fired. The cannon roared, muzzle flash washing the entire bow deck white, the mount flexing under recoil but holding, and held. Mitchell kept the trigger down, the M4 cycling at 2.5 rounds a second, and emptied the full magazine into the lead barge's waterline in 12 seconds flat. The first 3 rounds went through steel plate like paper. The 4th detonated inside the troop compartment. The fuel tank went up in a sheet of orange flame, men jumping clear into the black water, the barge coasting another 50 yards on momentum before it settled at the bow and stopped dead. Mitchell tore the spent magazine free and slammed a fresh one home in 8 seconds. An eternity in a firefight, but it worked. The second barge broke hard to port trying to run. Lynch closed to 600 yards. Mitchell fired 30 rounds in 12 seconds, 22 of them finding the hull. The first 5 stopped by armor, the 6th punching through, the 7th finding something volatile enough to end the argument entirely. The barge didn't burn. It exploded outright, the flash visible for miles. An ammunition cook-off that turned the whole vessel into scrap in under a second. The remaining 2 barges scattered in opposite directions. Lynch chased the one running south while the mount's rotating collar, already binding from heat, forced Mitchell to muscle the gun by hand to keep it tracking. At 700 yards, he fired his 3rd magazine while the barge's own machine gun found PT-48's bow, 1 round punching through the deck 18 inches from Mitchell's position. He didn't stop firing. Rounds walked from stern to bow until the engine died and the barge went dead in the water, crew abandoning into the sea. Disabled, not sunk, but finished as a threat regardless. PT-48 broke off at 0020, 90 rounds fired across 3 magazines. No jam, no mount failure, no deck collapse. 2 barges destroyed outright, 1 crippled, 0 American casualties. Lynch's radio call back to Calvert at Tulagi was short. The salvaged cannon worked, and it worked better than anyone had dared to expect. By 0300, every commander in the squadron wanted one, and the math turned brutal fast. 23 wrecked Airacobras against 12 operational PT boats meant the supply was going to run out long before the demand did. 3 more boats got cannons within 2 days regardless. The extraction process tightening from 2 hours down to 55 minutes per gun, as Kugan's crews learned exactly which bolts came first. Frey redesigned the mount after examining PT-48's wear, adding salvaged bronze bushings that let the 2nd-generation collars rotate smoothly under real combat load instead of grinding themselves apart. Ammunition became the next fight. Aircraft magazines built for a fight lasting seconds couldn't sustain a barge engagement that could run 20 minutes or more, and PT-48 had burned 90 rounds in its very first fight, against a total onboard supply of 180. Aviation ordnance crews started hand-loading magazines around the clock. 4 loaders working 12-hour shifts to produce roughly 40 magazines a day, against a fleet that needed 24 just to run 2 patrols a night. The arithmetic barely closed. The high-explosive rounds proved even more effective than anyone expected. Designed to tear through thin aircraft aluminum, they went through quarter-inch barge armor and opened 12-inch holes lined with shrapnel on the way in. 2 or 3 hits disabled a barge outright. 5 to 8 sank it for good. PT-40 destroyed 2 barges off Kimbo Bay on October 24th, in a single magazine, both burning and under the water inside 2 minutes. Japanese radio traffic intercepted days later carried a new, uneasy phrase for the boats now hunting their supply lines: demon boats with aircraft guns. By November 1st, 8 boats in Squadron 3 carried salvaged cannons, and Henderson Field had nothing left to strip. 21 guns pulled total, 17 mounted, 4 held as spares. A formal dispatch to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington that November laid out combat results too clean to dismiss. 14 barges destroyed across 8 patrols, 0 PT boats lost. On December 7th, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, the Bureau authorized standardized production mounts. New Airacobra cannons, pristine, factory fresh, meant originally for aircraft repair, got quietly diverted straight to PT squadrons through New Caledonia instead, flown in by Catalina rather than routed through official channels at all. By January 1943, 24 PT boats across 3 squadrons carried 37mm cannons, and the barge-busting capability had spread through the entire South Pacific force. That month alone, 37 patrols engaged Japanese barges, destroying 41, damaging 19, letting only 8 escape entirely. A complete reversal from a fleet that had been losing boats faster than it sank targets just 3 months earlier. The M4 gave way to a purpose-built naval cousin, the M9, entering production in August 1943, with a longer barrel, a 50% faster muzzle velocity, and range extended to 1,000 yards instead of 600. enough to engage barges before Japanese return fire could reliably answer back. By January 1944, cannons rolled off American shipyards already mounted at the factory, standard equipment rather than field improvisation. What started as a wrench and cutting torch job on a coral airstrip had become doctrine in 18 months flat, glacial by combat standards, remarkable by any bureaucratic one. The concept outlived the Solomons entirely. Squadron 8 carried factory cannons into New Guinea in 1943 and destroyed over 60 barges in 3 months. Mediterranean squadrons adopted the M9 against German F-lighters and Italian coastal craft in 1944. By the Philippines campaign in late 1944, PT boats running 37mm cannons had engaged 87 Japanese vessels in a single month, sinking 63 of them for the loss of not one boat to enemy fire. Post-war Navy analysis found boats carrying the cannon sank 6 times as many vessels per patrol as those without it, while crew losses across the Solomons campaign dropped 60% once the weapon reached the fleet. Total confirmed kills across the war exceeded 800 vessels, the overwhelming majority barges, together representing tens of thousands of Japanese troops and thousands of tons of supplies that never reached the men fighting to hold their ground. Lieutenant Robert Lynch commanded PT-48 through the entire Solomons campaign, survived the war, and received the Navy Cross for the innovation that started it all. He went home to Philadelphia, worked as an electrical engineer, and rarely spoke of the cannon again before he died in 1978. Kugan spent the rest of the war training gunners' mates on cannon maintenance and retired a master sergeant in 1962, his maintenance logs from Tulagi preserved today in the National Archives. Frey, who designed the pedestal mount that every factory version eventually copied, received no medal and no formal recognition at all, working at Tacoma shipyard until his death in 1991. Mitchell, who fired that first shot in anger on October 21, 1942, survived 42 more patrols, trained gunners aboard PT-109 itself, earned a Bronze Star at Vella La Vella, and died in 2006, having spent decades afterward at Boeing in Seattle, without ever making much of what he'd started. Of the 531 PT boats that served in the war, only 12 survive today, most of them still carrying the mounts that trace straight back to a welded aluminum sketch drawn on a coral runway in October 1942. Proof that sometimes the weapon that wins a war doesn't come from a design committee at all. It comes from men with a cutting torch, a real problem, and no patience left to wait for permission. If this story hit you the way it hit us, drop that like. It helps us bring more forgotten stories like this one to more people. Subscribe and turn the notifications on. We've got more of these coming. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if anyone in your family served in the Pacific, we want to hear it. Thanks for watching, and thanks for making sure Lynch, Mitchell, Frey, and Kugan don't disappear into silence.